The terrifying fate of the missing Ozark sisters began on a September morning in 1882. 16-year-old Tobias Henley woke to find his sisters' beds empty. Mary Elizabeth and Sarah May never broke promises, never stayed out past midnight, never worried their widowed mother, but they never came home from the harvest dance. The entire town of Millfield Hollow searched for weeks. Their trusted neighbor, Deacon Josiah Crawford, organized every search party. He'd been like a father to the family for 20 years. When bodies were found at Devil's Canyon, Crawford delivered their eulogy with tears in his eyes. But Tobias found something that changed everything, a hidden cellar beneath Crawford's barn. Inside were chains on the walls, makeshift beds, personal belongings from not just his sisters, but from girls who'd vanished across 3 counties for over a decade. How long can a monster hide behind the face of a saint? And who else was keeping his secret? The morning of September 15th, 1882, arrived in Millfield Hollow with the kind of crisp Arkansas air that promised autumn's approach. But Tobias Henley felt only the cold dread that had settled in his chest like a stone. He stood in the doorway of his sister's shared bedroom, staring at beds that had not been slept in, quilts still perfectly smoothed from yesterday morning's careful making. Mary Elizabeth always tucked the corners just so, and Sarah May always left her pillow slightly askew. But today, everything remained exactly as it had been when they left for the harvest dance the evening before. Tobias pressed his palms against the doorframe until his knuckles went white. 16 years old, and the man of the house since his father's death 3 years prior. He had developed an instinct for trouble that now screamed warnings through every fiber of his being. His sisters were creatures of habit, bound by routines as reliable as sunrise. Mary Elizabeth, at 19, never missed her morning prayers or her responsibility to help their mother with breakfast. Sarah May, 17 and quieter than her older sister, always braided her hair while humming the same hymn their father used to whistle while working his tools. The silence where those familiar sounds should have been felt wrong, dangerous, like the moments before a storm breaks. Tobias. His mother's voice drifted up from the kitchen, thin and already touched with worry. Ruth Henley had learned to read silence the way other women read scripture, and she knew the particular quality of emptiness that meant her daughters were truly gone, rather than simply late to rise. He found her standing at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The widow S. weeds she still wore 3 years after burying her husband made her appear even smaller and more fragile than her 42 years warranted. And Tobias felt the familiar crush of responsibility settle across his shoulders like a yoke. "They never came home, did they?" she whispered, not turning from the window. Tobias moved to stand beside her, following her gaze across their small property to the rolling hills beyond. Millfield Hollow was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where young women didn't simply vanish without explanation, where the harvest dance was chaperoned by half the adults in town and ended promptly at 11th Shire with prayers and thanks for the season's bounty. "Maybe they stayed with the Morrison girls," he offered, though he knew it wasn't true. Mary Elizabeth would never worry their mother so, not when Ruth had already buried one member of their family and lived in constant fear of losing another. By noon, word had spread through the settlement like wildfire through dry grass. The Henley girls were missing, and that was impossible, unthinkable, wrong, in every way that mattered to the tight-knit community of Millfield Hollow. Mary Elizabeth taught Sunday school to the youngest children and never raised her voice, not even to the most mischievous boys. Sarah May helped old Mrs. Whitman with her washing and always carried extra biscuits to families who were struggling. These were not girls who ran off with traveling merchants or disappeared into the night with secret beaux. These were the daughters every parent hoped to raise, the young women who represented everything good and pure about their small corner of the Arkansas wilderness. Josiah Crawford arrived at the Henley home just after 1 noon. his weathered face grave with concern, and his hat clutched respectfully in his hands. At 45, Crawford commanded respect throughout the Hollow, not just for his successful farm and substantial land holdings, but for his position as deacon at the Baptist church and his reputation for helping neighbors in times of trouble. He had been like a second father to Tobias since the logging accident that claimed his father's life, teaching him to hunt and fish and work the land with patience and kindness that never felt condescending. "Ruth, I've organized search parties," Crawford said, his deep voice steady and reassuring. "Every able-bodied man in the Hollow will be out looking for those girls before sundown. We'll find them, don't you worry. Likely they took shelter somewhere when that storm came through last night, and they're just waiting for someone to come fetch them home." Tobias studied Crawford's face, noting the way the older man's eyes didn't quite meet his mother's, the slight tremor in his hands as he replaced his hat. These were small things, nearly invisible, but Tobias had learned to watch for such details in the years since he'd become responsible for his family's welfare. Something about Crawford's manner felt forced, performed, like the careful way people spoke at funerals when they were trying to say the right things about the deceased. The search continued through the afternoon and into the evening, with men combing the dense woods and rocky ravines that surrounded the settlement. Crawford organized them with military precision, assigning groups to different sectors and establishing a central meeting point to report findings. The women gathered at the church to prepare food and comfort Ruth Henley, their voices low with prayers and speculation about what might have befallen the beloved sisters. On the third day, when hope was beginning to transform into the kind of dread that settled permanently in people's hearts, Tobias made the discovery that would change everything. He had been searching alone along the eastern edge of Crawford's property, following a fence line that separated the deacon's pasture from the wild timber beyond. The autumn wind had picked up, rustling through the oak and hickory trees with enough force to set loose anything that might have caught on the fence during recent storms. There, fluttering from a weathered fence post like a prayer flag, was Sarah May's blue ribbon. Tobias recognized it immediately. Their mother had given each girl identical ribbons for their birthdays, and Sarah May always wore hers to church on special occasions. The fabric was torn and stained as if it had been pulled free with considerable force, and seeing it there sent ice through Tobias's veins. He carried the ribbon to Crawford with hands that shook despite his efforts to remain calm. The older man was directing another search party near the dangerous ravines that everyone called Devil's Canyon, where several people had fallen to their deaths over the years. When Tobias approached with his discovery, Crawford's face went through a series of expressions too quick to catalogue: surprise, concern, and something else that might have been fear. "Must have blown here from the canyon," Crawford said after examining the ribbon, his voice carefully neutral. "That wind last night was powerful enough to carry anything for miles. We should concentrate our search there tomorrow, down in those ravines where a person might not hear calls for help." That night, Tobias lay in his narrow bed, unable to find sleep, his mind turning over the day's events like a man examining a puzzle with missing pieces. Through his window, he could see Crawford's property spread out in the moonlight, the barn and outbuildings casting long shadows across the pasture. It was past 2 in the morning when he saw it, a strange, flickering glow emanating from Crawford East barn, warm yellow light that had no business being there at such an hour. Crawford was not a man who worked his livestock at night, and there was no reason for anyone to be in that barn with a lantern when the rest of the Hollow slept peacefully. Tobias watched the light for nearly an hour, noting how it moved and shifted as if someone was walking back and forth inside the building. When it finally disappeared, leaving only darkness and the sound of wind through the trees, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool September air. Something was wrong in Millfield Hollow, something that went deeper than 2 missing girls and a blue ribbon caught on a fence post. And somehow Josiah Crawford, the man who had been like a father to him, the respected deacon who organized search parties and comforted grieving mothers, was at the center of it all. The days that followed Sarah May's ribbon discovery settled over Millfield Hollow like a shroud, heavy with unspoken fears and growing whispers that seemed to follow Tobias wherever he went. He found himself watching Josiah Crawford with an intensity that bordered on obsession, noting every gesture, every expression, every word that passed the deacon's lips. The man who had once felt like a second father now seemed like a stranger wearing a familiar face, and the change was so subtle that Tobias began to question his own sanity. Crawford's behavior had shifted in ways that might have been invisible to anyone else, but Tobias had learned to read people the way his father had once read the forest, looking for signs of danger that others might miss. The older man no longer met his eyes directly when they spoke, instead letting his gaze drift to some point just over Tobias's shoulder. His hands, which had always been steady and sure when working or gesturing, now carried a slight tremor that became more pronounced whenever the missing girls were mentioned. Most tellingly, Crawford had begun avoiding the Henley property altogether, sending messages through neighbors rather than visiting in person, as he had done consistently for the past 3 years. When Crawford did appear at the daily search coordination meetings, he insisted on redirecting efforts toward Beckham Ridge, a series of rocky outcroppings nearly 10 miles from where Sarah May's ribbon had been discovered. His arguments were logical enough. Perhaps the girls had become disoriented in the dark and wandered farther than anyone suspected. But something about his urgency to search everywhere except his own property struck Tobias as fundamentally wrong. Meanwhile, the community's initial sympathy for the Henley family began to curdle into something darker and more insidious. At first, the whispers were barely audible, passed between women at the general store or men gathered around the blacksmith's forge. Perhaps the girls had planned their disappearance. Perhaps they had been secretly meeting boys from neighboring settlements. Perhaps they were not the pure, innocent daughters everyone believed them to be. Mrs. Adelaide Marsh, the banker's wife and unofficial arbiter of social acceptability in Millfield Hollow, was heard to remark that Mary Elizabeth had seemed overly friendly with the traveling preacher who had visited in July. Sarah May, according to increasingly creative speculation, had been seen walking alone near the river on several occasions, surely inappropriate behavior for a proper young lady. The fact that no one could provide specific dates or witnesses to these alleged transgressions seemed less important than the community's growing need to find explanations that didn't threaten their sense of safety. Ruth Henley felt the weight of these whispers like physical blows, each sideways glance and abruptly ended conversation driving her deeper into a grief that was now compounded by shame. She had raised her daughters to be models of Christian virtue, and the suggestion that they might have brought their fate upon themselves through moral failings cut deeper than any physical wound. Tobias watched his mother grow thinner and more fragile with each passing day, her faith in both God and community crumbling under the pressure of losing her daughters and facing the judgment of neighbors she had considered friends. It was on the 10th morning after the girl's disappearance, when fog rolled through the hollow thick enough to muffle sound and obscure vision beyond a dozen yards, that Tobias made his decision to search Crawford's property more thoroughly. He had been wrestling with suspicions that felt too terrible to voice, but the image of that mysterious light in the barn haunted his sleep and made concentration impossible. If Crawford was innocent, then a careful search would prove it and allow Tobias to focus his fears elsewhere. If Crawford was hiding something, then Tobias needed to know what it was. Moving through the fog like a ghost, Tobias made his way across the familiar fields and pastures of Crawford's land, staying close to fence lines and tree rows to avoid detection. He had played on this property as a child, knew every building and boundary marker, which made what he discovered behind the main barn all the more shocking. There, partially concealed by fallen leaves and overgrown brush, was a cellar door he had never noticed before. Not in 20 years of visiting Crawford's property, not in countless games of hide-and-seek with his sisters, not in the hundreds of times he had helped with harvest and animal care. The door itself was weathered wood that might have been there for decades, but the heavy iron lock securing it was clearly new, its surface still bright with oil and free of the rust that covered every other piece of metal on Crawford's property. Around the cellar entrance, the earth showed signs of recent disturbance, not the settled packed ground of an old root cellar, but loose soil that had been turned and re-tamped within the past few weeks. The discovery sent ice through Tobias' veins and made his hands shake as he examined the lock more closely. When Crawford found him there an hour later, the fog had begun to lift, and Tobias was still crouched beside the mysterious cellar door. The older man emerged from the mist like an apparition, his face terrible in its controlled fury, his voice deadly quiet when he spoke. "You seem to have lost your way, boy." Tobias straightened slowly, meeting Crawford's eyes for the first time in days. "I was just wondering about this cellar, Mr. Crawford. I don't remember it being here before." Crawford's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, calculation, and finally a cold hardness that Tobias had never seen before. "It's just old root storage," he said, but his hands were shaking visibly now. "Been there longer than you've been alive, just hidden by the brush. Nothing interesting about it." "Then why the new lock?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and Tobias watched Crawford's face carefully for any sign of the man who had taught him to whittle and fish and be strong for his mother. Instead, he saw only a stranger who spoke with Crawford's voice, but looked at him with eyes that held no warmth, no paternal affection, only warning. "Boy, you'd be wise to stop poking around where you don't belong," Crawford said, his voice carrying an edge that made the hair on Tobias's neck rise. "Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. Your family has enough troubles without you stirring up more." That evening, as Ruth Henley sat mending by lamplight and Tobias struggled with homework he couldn't concentrate on, Crawford appeared at their door with news that should have brought closure, but instead filled the small house with a different kind of horror. His face was appropriately grave, his voice properly sorrowful as he delivered the words that would change everything. "Ruth, Tobias, I'm afraid I have terrible news. They found the girls' bodies at the bottom of Devil's Canyon. Marshal Pike says they must have fallen during that storm. I'm so very sorry." But as Crawford offered his condolences and spoke of arrangements for burial, Tobias noticed something that made his blood run cold. The deacon's boots were caked with a particular type of mud, dark, marshy soil that came from only one place in all of Millfield Hollow, the low-lying ground behind Crawford's barn, where water collected after rains and where a hidden cellar door waited beneath its shiny new lock. The funeral held for Mary Elizabeth and Sarah May Henley. 3 days later was a grotesque theatre of community grief that made Tobias's skin crawl with revulsion. The entire population of Millfield Hollow gathered in the small Baptist church, their faces appropriately solemn, as they mourned 2 young women whose bodies lay in pine coffins that Tobias knew contained strangers. He sat in the front pew beside his mother, who wept genuine tears for daughters she believed were finally at rest, while Crawford stood at the pulpit, delivering a eulogy that painted the girls as tragic victims of accident and God's mysterious plan. Crawford's performance was masterful in its sincerity, his voice breaking at precisely the right moments as he spoke of Mary Elizabeth's dedication to teaching the Lord's word, and Sarah May's gentle spirit of service to others. He comforted Ruth Henley with words of scripture and promises that her daughters now walked with angels, his hand resting paternally on her shoulder, while Tobias watched from mere feet away, knowing that this man had murdered his sisters or sold them into something worse than death. Marshal Pike, Crawford's brother-in-law and the settlement's sole representative of law enforcement, had closed the investigation with indecent haste. Pike was a man whose badge seemed to carry more weight than his character warranted. His authority derived more from family connections and political maneuvering than from any particular skill at maintaining justice. When approached by several community members who questioned whether a proper examination had been conducted, Pike dismissed their concerns with patronizing explanations about tragic accidents and the need to let grieving families find peace. The marshal had not called for Dr. Samuel Morrison, the circuit physician who visited the Hollow monthly to tend to medical needs that exceeded the capabilities of local midwives and folk remedies. This omission struck Tobias as significant, since Morrison was known throughout the region for his methodical approach to examining suspicious deaths and his willingness to challenge official conclusions when evidence suggested alternative explanations. Pike's failure to involve Morrison suggested either shocking incompetence or deliberate avoidance of professional scrutiny. After the funeral service, as the community dispersed to their homes with satisfied expressions of duty fulfilled and proper grief observed, Tobias found himself consumed by a rage so pure and focused that it felt like divine inspiration. He could not allow this charade to continue, could not permit Crawford to maintain his facade of respectability while his sister's fate remained unknown and unavenged. That night, as thunder rolled across the Arkansas hills and rain began to fall in torrents that would provide perfect cover for desperate actions, Tobias made his way back to Crawford's property with a crowbar stolen from his own family's tool shed. The storm that lashed Millfield Hollow that evening was the kind that old-timers called a gully washer, with lightning that split the sky like the wrath of an angry god and thunder that shook the windows of every house in the settlement. Tobias used the chaos of wind and rain to mask his approach to Crawford's property, knowing that the older man would be secure in his house, confident that his secret was safe, and his performance convincing enough to end all questions about the Henley sisters' fate. Breaking the lock on the cellar door required more effort than Tobias had anticipated, but desperation gave him strength beyond his 16 years, and eventually the iron hasp gave way with a screech that was swallowed by the storm. Fury. What he discovered when he descended into that underground chamber destroyed his understanding of the world, and replaced it with a horror so profound that he would carry its weight for the rest of his life. The cellar had been converted into a prison that spoke of years of careful planning and unspeakable use. Heavy chains were bolted to the stone walls at intervals that suggested multiple occupants, their metal worn smooth by desperate hands and marked with rust that might have been something darker than oxidation. Makeshift beds constructed from straw and rough blankets were arranged around the space, each bearing signs of recent occupation. Strands of hair, fragments of clothing, personal items that told stories of terror and desperation. Among these belongings, Tobias found objects that confirmed his worst fears and revealed the scope of Crawford's crimes. A locket that belonged to Catherine Mills, who had disappeared from a settlement 30 miles south the previous spring. A pair of spectacles that had belonged to Rebecca Foster, missing from her family's farm for over 2 years. Most devastating of all, he found pages torn from his sister's own diaries, written in their familiar handwriting, but documenting experiences so horrific that reading them felt like a violation of their memory. Mary Elizabeth's entries, written in her careful script, described their capture and imprisonment with a clarity that suggested she had maintained hope, even in the darkest circumstances. She wrote of Crawford's visits to the cellar, his explanations that they were being prepared for transport to buyers who would appreciate their particular qualities. She documented the arrival and departure of other girls, some sold to traders who worked the river routes toward New Orleans, others simply disappearing one night, never to return. Her final entry dated just days before the false funeral, described her determination to resist and protect Sarah May, even if it meant her own death. Sarah May's writings were fewer and written in a shakier hand that spoke of trauma and terror, but they contained details that revealed the full extent of Crawford's network. She named other men from Millfield Hollow and surrounding communities. Reverend Blackwell, who provided religious justification for the girl's supposed moral failings. Samuel Garrett, who owned the mill and helped transport victims. Even Marshal Pike, who ensured that investigations remained superficial and quickly closed. The horror of these revelations was interrupted by footsteps on the cellar stairs, and Tobias looked up to see Dr. Morrison descending into the underground chamber. Morrison was a thin, serious man in his 50s, whose medical practice had brought him into contact with enough suspicious injuries and unexplained deaths to develop a healthy skepticism about official explanations. When Tobias had approached him earlier that day with questions about the examination of bodies found at Devil's Canyon, Morrison had admitted that he found Pike's failure to involve him professionally disturbing. "Dear God," Morrison whispered as he took in the scene around them, his physician's eye immediately understanding the purpose of the chains and makeshift beds. "How long has this been happening?" Tobias handed him several of the diary pages, watching the older man's face grow pale as he read his sister's final words. Morrison's medical training had exposed him to human suffering in many forms, but the systematic nature of Crawford's crimes and the involvement of trusted community leaders clearly shook him to his core. "We need to gather everything," Morrison said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Every piece of evidence, every document. This goes far beyond your sisters, Tobias. This is a conspiracy that reaches into every level of authority in this region." But when they returned to the cellar the following evening, with bags to collect evidence and witnesses to document what they had found, the underground chamber was completely empty. Every chain had been removed, every personal belonging cleared away, every trace of the prison's existence eliminated so thoroughly that it might never have existed at all. Standing in the clean cellar were Crawford, Marshal Pike, and two other men Tobias recognized as Samuel Garrett and Reverend Blackwell, their faces grim with purpose and their eyes cold with the knowledge that their secret had been discovered. "You should have listened when I warned you, boy," Crawford said, his voice carrying none of the paternal warmth that had once comforted Tobias in times of trouble. "Some truths are too dangerous for children to know." The barn where Crawford and his conspirators imprisoned Tobias and Dr. Morrison smelled of hay and animal sweat. But underneath those familiar odors lurked something else, the metallic scent of fear and the mustiness that comes from places where terrible things have happened in darkness. They were bound with rope that cut into their wrists and ankles, seated on rough wooden crates while their captors stood in a circle around them like judges pronouncing sentence. The lantern light flickered across faces that Tobias had known his entire life, respected men of the community whose duplicity now felt like a physical wound. Crawford seemed almost relieved to finally shed his mask of respectability, his shoulders relaxing as he abandoned the careful performance that had defined his public persona for decades. When he spoke, his voice carried the satisfaction of a man who had carried a heavy secret too long and found unexpected pleasure in finally sharing its weight. 15 years, Crawford said, his eyes bright with something that might have been pride. 15 years of taking what this world owes me, and not one person in authority ever asked the right questions. Your precious sisters weren't the first, boy, and they won't be the last. Girls disappear all the time in places like this. Runaways, accidents, moral failings that shame their families into silence. Dr. Morrison struggled against his bonds, his medical training making him acutely aware of their physical vulnerability and the calculated coldness in Crawford's demeanor. "How many?" he asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "How many families have you destroyed?" Reverend Blackwell stepped forward, his clerical collar catching the lamplight as he spoke with the same authority he used from the pulpit. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Doctor. These girls were destined for lives of sin and degradation anyway. We simply redirected their paths toward usefulness. Better to serve in a New Orleans brothel than to corrupt good Christian communities with their wanton behavior." The Reverend S. words revealed the philosophical framework that had allowed these men to justify their crimes, a twisted theology that transformed victims into sinners and predators into instruments of divine will. Samuel Garrett, the mill owner whose riverboat connections had made the trafficking operation possible, nodded his agreement while counting coins from a leather pouch that represented profits from human misery. Crawford continued his confession with the enthusiasm of a businessman explaining a successful enterprise. The network extended far beyond Millfield Hollow, reaching into settlements across 3 counties where respected community leaders identified vulnerable young women and created opportunities for their disappearance. Some girls were taken during supposed accidents or while traveling alone. Others were lured with promises of employment or marriage prospects in distant towns. The most valuable victims were those like the Henley sisters, beautiful, educated, and known for their virtue, which commanded premium prices from buyers who specialized in breaking the spirits of innocent women. Marshal Pike's role had been crucial in maintaining the conspiracy's secrecy, ensuring that investigations remained superficial and that bodies found in remote locations were quickly attributed to accidents or animal attacks. His badge gave him the authority to control information and intimidate anyone who asked too many questions, while his family connection to Crawford provided additional motivation for cooperation. "Your sister Mary Elizabeth fought too hard," Crawford said, his tone matter-of-fact as he described atrocities that should have been spoken in whispers. "Tried to organize the other girls, planned an escape that would have compromised everything. We had to make an example of her, show the others what happened to troublemakers. But Sarah May learned her lesson quickly enough. She's probably settling into her new life in New Orleans by now, earning her keep and learning to be grateful for the opportunities we provided." Dr. Morrison made his escape attempt during the 2nd night of their captivity, when exhaustion had made their guards careless, and a brief argument about disposal methods created a momentary distraction. The Dr. S. medical knowledge had taught him how to dislocate his own thumb to slip free of his bonds, and his desperation gave him strength beyond his years as he fought his way toward the barn door. But freedom was only steps away when Samuel Garrett's rifle shot echoed through the building, the sound so loud in the enclosed space that Tobias's ears rang for hours afterward. Morrison's body crumpled near the threshold, his blood seeping into the hay-covered floor as Crawford stood over him with the same casual indifference he might show toward a dead rat. "Dr. Morrison was always too curious for his own good," Crawford observed, nudging the corpse with his boot. "His body will be found at Devil's Canyon tomorrow." Another tragic accident involving someone who wandered too close to dangerous ground. The thunderstorm that struck on the 3rd night brought rain so intense that it drummed against the barn roof like gunfire and sent water cascading through gaps in the weathered boards. Lightning illuminated the building's interior in stark, momentary flashes, while thunder shook the entire structure and made conversation impossible. It was during one of these deafening crashes that Tobias managed to work his bonds loose, using techniques Morrison had whispered to him before the Dr. S. failed escape. Crawford's men had grown overconfident, assuming that one dead physician and a traumatized boy posed little threat to their established operation. They huddled around their lantern, playing cards and drinking whiskey, their attention focused inward while the storm raged beyond the barn walls. Tobias used their distraction and the storm's noise to slip through a gap in the back wall that he remembered from childhood games, his knowledge of Crawford's property finally serving as salvation rather than betrayal. The journey home through the flooding darkness tested every survival skill his father had taught him, as rain-swollen creeks became torrents and familiar landmarks disappeared beneath sheets of water. Lightning strikes illuminated a landscape transformed by the storm's violence, and more than once Tobias found himself chest-deep in water that had been dry ground hours before. But desperation drove him forward through conditions that should have killed him, the need to warn his mother and seek help overriding every instinct for self-preservation. He found Ruth Henley in her bedroom at dawn, her body arranged peacefully on the bed she had shared with her husband, a bottle of laudanum empty on the nightstand beside a letter written in her careful script. The note spoke of unbearable shame at the whispers surrounding her daughter's disappearance, of guilt at failing to protect them, and of certainty that death offered the only escape from a world that had become too cruel to endure. Crawford arrived an hour after Tobias discovered his mother's body, his face appropriately grave as he offered comfort to the orphan boy and explanations to neighbors who gathered to witness another tragedy befalling the cursed Henley family. The deacon spoke eloquently of Ruth's overwhelming grief and the way sorrow could poison a faithful heart, while Marshal Pike nodded sympathetically and declared the death a clear case of suicide brought on by maternal anguish. No one questioned their conclusions. No one demanded investigation, and no one seemed to notice the way Crawford watched Tobias with eyes that promised consequences for any attempt to challenge the official narrative. Standing beside his mother's grave as dirt fell onto her pine coffin, Tobias understood with crystalline clarity that he had lost everything. His sisters to trafficking and murder, his mother to despair and suicide, his faith in community and authority to the revelation of systematic corruption. At 16 years old, he was utterly alone in a world where monsters wore the faces of trusted neighbors, and justice existed only as a comfortable lie told by those who benefited from its absence. The months following his mother A.'s funeral transformed Tobias Henley from a grieving boy into something harder and more purposeful, a seeker of justice who understood that truth could only emerge through methodical documentation and patient accumulation of evidence. Standing alone in the small house that had once sheltered his entire family, surrounded by the silence of the dead and the indifference of neighbors who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. If the established systems of law and community leadership were corrupted beyond redemption, then he would become the conscience his settlement lacked, regardless of the personal cost. Through the winter of 1882 and into the spring of 1883, Tobias began the painstaking work of connecting disappearances across the region to Crawford's network. Using his inheritance from his parents' small farm, he traveled to settlements throughout Arkansas and the Indian Territory, seeking out families whose daughters had vanished under circumstances that local authorities had dismissed as accidents or moral failings. The pattern he uncovered was both systematic and horrifying. Young women of particular beauty or education disappearing from communities where Crawford or his associates had business connections, their fates explained away by respected men who benefited from public acceptance of simple answers to complex tragedies. His breakthrough came when he contacted Clara Whitmore, a journalist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch who had made her reputation exposing corruption in rural communities where federal oversight was minimal and local authority figures operated without meaningful scrutiny. Clara was a woman whose own experiences with violence and dismissal had taught her to listen carefully to voices that others chose to ignore. And she recognized in Tobias, as carefully documented evidence, the foundation of a story that could challenge the systems that allowed predators to operate with impunity. Working together through coded correspondence and clandestine meetings in towns far from Millfield Hollow, Tobias and Clara built a case that connected 17 disappearances across 3 counties to a trafficking network that had operated for over a decade. They documented financial connections between the conspirators, traced shipping routes that moved human cargo down the Arkansas River toward New Orleans, and interviewed survivors whose testimonies had been previously dismissed or suppressed by local authorities. Clara's first article appeared in the St. Louis paper on a Sunday morning in July 1883. Its headline stark and uncompromising. The Arkansas Horror: How Respected Citizens Built an Empire of Human Trafficking. The story named names, provided dates and locations, and included enough corroborating evidence to make denial impossible. Within days, newspapers across the region had picked up the story, and within a week, federal marshals were traveling south from Little Rock with warrants and authority that superseded local law enforcement. Crawford's attempt to flee came too late to save him, as Clara's investigation had already provided federal authorities with detailed knowledge of his network and associates. He was captured at the Arkansas-Louisiana border with documents that implicated a dozen other men across 3 counties, his wagon loaded with personal belongings and enough cash to suggest years of profitable criminality. The man who had once commanded respect as a pillar of the community was reduced to a desperate fugitive whose capture marked the beginning of the end for the entire conspiracy. The trials that followed exposed the full scope of the trafficking operation and forced communities throughout the region to confront their complicity in systematic evil. Crawford, Marshall Pike, Reverend Blackwell, Samuel Garrett, and 4 other men were convicted of multiple counts of kidnapping, trafficking, and murder. Their executions, carried out on a cold morning in February 1884, drew crowds from across Arkansas who came to witness justice for crimes that had hidden behind facades of respectability and religious authority. But justice, when it finally arrived, could not resurrect the dead or heal the trauma of the living. 17 families across the region learned the fates of daughters they had mourned as accidents or runaways. And while some girls were recovered from New Orleans brothels and trafficking operations, they returned home forever changed by experiences that would shadow them for the rest of their lives. Sarah May was among those rescued, but the sister who came back to Millfield Hollow was not the gentle girl who had left for a harvest dance nearly 2 years before. Tobias used his modest inheritance to transform his family's property into a memorial garden for all the victims of Crawford's network. Not just his sisters, but every girl whose disappearance had been ignored, explained away, or forgotten by communities that preferred convenient lies to difficult truths. The garden became a place of pilgrimage for grieving families and a constant reminder to Millfield Hollow of the price of willful blindness. Slowly, reluctantly, the community began to change how it responded to missing persons and questioned authority, though the transformation came at a cost measured in broken trust and shattered illusions. By 1886, when Tobias had reached his 20th year, he had become known throughout Arkansas as an advocate for families whose loved ones had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Clara Whitmore had built upon their collaboration to become a nationally recognized journalist whose work exposing rural corruption had inspired federal legislation strengthening oversight of local law enforcement. The network they had exposed together was broken, its leaders dead or imprisoned. But the victory felt hollow to Tobias as he tended flowers on memorial stones that marked lives that could never be recovered. Sarah May lived with him in the house where they had once been children, but she rarely spoke of her ordeal or showed interest in the community that had failed to protect her. Her silence was both protection and prison, a necessary barrier against memories too terrible to examine, but too powerful to forget. Sometimes Tobias caught glimpses of the sister he had known, a flash of humor, a moment of tenderness, but mostly She existed in a carefully maintained distance from a world that had revealed its capacity for unthinkable cruelty. On a spring morning in 1887, as Tobias knelt among the memorial flowers planting new blooms on Mary Elizabeth's marker, a young girl approached him with hesitant steps and eyes wide with the particular fear that comes from recent loss. She was perhaps 12 years old, her dress neat but worn, her manner suggesting the careful politeness of children who have learned that adults hold all the power and most of the answers. "Mr. Henley," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "my sister Emma has been missing for 3 days. Mama sent me to ask if you might know what questions we should be asking." Tobias looked up from the soil and flowers, seeing in this child's frightened face an echo of his own desperation from 5 years before. But this time was different. This time he knew exactly what questions to ask, whom to contact, and how to ensure that no family would suffer in silence while predators operated behind masks of respectability. The cycle of willful blindness that had allowed Crawford's network to flourish had been broken, replaced by vigilance and the hard-won knowledge that evil most often wore familiar faces. "Tell your mother I'll be along shortly," he said, brushing dirt from his hands as he rose from his sister's grave, "and tell her that this time someone is listening."